to remember a little bit of history. So understand that by the time we are in 1930, there are still veterans of the Civil War alive, people who remember the war. There are still the amputees, the people suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. The war is still a living memory for many Americans, which is simply to say that when you think about this period in American history, this period in American history between the world wars also has a history. It's one that really, in many ways, goes back to this calamity that we spent so much time talking about earlier in this colloquium. So a civil war followed by a period of Reconstruction, and a period of Reconstruction and Gilded Age through the First World War that is marked not by linear progress. In other words, this is not a seamless story of America progressing towards some kind of city on a hill. It's a story fraught with a great deal of conflict. So your economic history comes in useful here. Okay? And you remember after the Civil War, things are chugging along really reasonably well until 1873. And in 1873, there was a panic. A gripping word, that's what they were called. This is pre-Freud. Nobody talks about economic depressions until after Freud. Okay? It's much more graphic. I mean, the word panic really works. I mean, you all know what panic is. You work with lots of kids who panic. A lot of you adults have panic attacks, and panic really works. So 1873, it's a financial crisis precipitated by Europeans calling in loans because they got very nervous about bogus stock shares being sold by Jay Gould. That was one of the triggering events. So 1873, the economy tanks. And understand that because Americans are optimistic, we usually put the beginning dates on these things, implying that they're only one-year phenomena. 1873 marks the beginning of the Panic of 1873. It goes national, starts on the East Coast, but it's going to last for pretty much all of the 1870s. Across the 1880s, the economy sputters to a kind of very slow recovery, fits and starts, but a lot of concern about the future of the country, about the future of the economy. In 1877, because wages were cut along railroad lines, the United States had its first nationwide general strike. Across the 1880s, multiple strikes, even bombings. Haymarket, 1886. The economy is unstable. It's rickety, but doing okay until 1893. And what you need to understand is that in 1893, the bottom fell out. Big time. And until the Great Depression of the 30s, the Depression of the 1890s was the Great Depression. It lasted for a decade. Phenomenal unemployment. It moves everywhere. Urban, rural America. Think of the 1930s, what you know about that, project that back onto the 1890s. The economy's in dire straits. What are we going to do about the future? That question leads to a couple of reform movements. One of them, the populists. Okay, the other, capital S, socialists. What they had in common, both groups wanted to nationalize railroads. The socialists wanted to nationalize a whole lot more. Okay, reform. The economy needs to be reformed. One of the problems, maldistribution of wealth. What do we do about people like the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, having so much money? Idea. Income tax. 100 years ago, income tax amendment goes into the Constitution of the United States. Okay? In response to this kind of economic tumult, we get political reform. Okay? What people forget is that the economy more or less recovers by the early 20th century, but in 1907 there's another financial panic. And then right before World War I, the economy again appears to be heading downhill, a lot of nervousness in the financial economic quarters about the future. That in part, at least many historians would argue, is why Woodrow Wilson abandoned his strong stance to keep America out of the war in Europe. because he realized that without American intervention, if the Allies did not pull off a victory, European markets would be potentially closed to American agriculturalists and industrialists. So, we're getting closer to the interwar period. What happens at the end of the war? Well, in short term, big problem, because all of the troops, all of the American troops went overseas, came home. And what did they expect? Jobs. What did they find? Unemployment. Really a nasty political situation through the end of the 19-teens. By 1920, 1921, the industrial sector of the economy picking up, and this is really the beginning part of my story. Because the 1920s are remembered, I think correctly, as a decade of prosperity for most, not all of course, but for most Americans. The 1920s was a decade the likes of which most Americans had never seen. And what I want to do is talk with you a little bit about the 1920s, about why this was a prosperity decade, and what made it possible and what brought it to an end. Starting point is a war. Wars are terrible, terrible things. Except wars come to an end. And one of the pieces of military history that often isn't taught is that at the end of wars, things have to be put back together again. Understand in Europe, the First World War, it's not called the First World War, you can't have a First World War until you have a Second World War, right? So the war in Europe is called the Great War for Civilization. It's referred to as the Great War, not because it was a heroic war, but because it was such a massive, massive conflict. Just extraordinary. The phrase lost generation, usually affixed to writers, to poets, musicians. It's more generally applied to the European belligerents, who indeed lost a generation, primarily of young men. This was a horrific war, Europe largely destroyed. That's bad news, except it's not. It's actually really good news, if in fact you have the resources to help Europe rebuild. And there was one nation that had those resources, the United States. During the 1920s, there existed overseas, especially in Europe, an enormous mass market for American goods. Why had the economy gone under routinely since the end of the Civil War? The argument was the economy tanked repeatedly, not because of the failures of the American economic system, but because of its success. What does that mean? What was successful about the American economy was simply that American industrialists and American farmers produced a lot. If you think about the revolution in agriculture, by the 1890s, the Great Plains, the Central Valley in California, generating more wheat than the world knew what to do with. American industry by 1900 is outproducing the British in many sectors. That's success, except producing so much has the effect of depressing prices. What's the solution to depressed prices, to the problem of overproduction? Find new markets. That's the war with Spain in 1898. And after World War I, it is this mass market that exists overseas that in many ways stimulates the American economic recovery after the war. By the 1920s, the war, post-war industrial footing of the economy resulted in near full employment. With full employment came the accumulation of demand here in this country for so-called consumer durable goods, cars, refrigerators, radios, and don't forget that in addition to this domestic mass market, you had Europe's destruction and the demand for American capital for its reconstruction. So that's the first thing to realize about this interwar period. You have a mass market called into creation overseas and in the United States. With this market, comes demand for American goods, agricultural and industrial. What fueled this demand were new technologies or methods of mass production. And you'll hear more about these over the course of the next couple of days. Especially methods of mass production, assembly line production, really brought to a status of near perfection during the First World War. The standardization of parts, their assemblage made work a whole lot easier in one sense. How so? Take Henry Ford's plants, for instance. The central principle was no extra steps, no bending over. The idea was that assembly lines brought the component parts to you. You didn't have to stoop, pick things up. You didn't have to reach down to take things off. And just so you know, Ford did not invent the assembly line. Okay, the assembly line was actually developed in the meat packing industry in Chicago. Okay, and there was a disassembly line because the carcasses of animals would be moved by belts and the animals would be disassembled. Ford took that technology and basically adjusted its height, adjusted its speed. So the disassembly line became an assembly line. Ford's central principle was no extra steps for workers, and wherever possible, no stooping over. But assembly line work also speeded up the process of production, and in the eyes of its critics, rendered workers mere objects. You'll see some snippets, Jim will show them from the film, Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. Another factor, the third factor underlying the economic growth of the 1920s is related to the first two. Mass consumption depended upon the development of new technologies of distribution and finance. So chief among the new improved financial techniques to broaden consumer demand was something that again wasn't invented in the 1920s, but really applied on a much more massive scale. This was a plan called installment buying. Okay, in the late 19th century, it is in the agricultural sector of the economy that McCormick sold reapers to farmers on time, allowing them to go into debt, take out loans to buy his machines. 1920s, by the 1920s, this installment plan of purchasing, buying on time, starts to sweep other sectors of the economy, especially the production of automobiles. Buying on time, it is such a noble idea. How much credit card debt do Americans carry today? Less than they did 5 years ago. But it's still absolutely extraordinary. The very idea that you should buy things on time and pay them off over time is a pretty interesting financial concept. Tied to that is another innovation, one your students should know about. It's the advent of something called mass saturation advertising. And I'm just going to describe this to you because you can find this stuff on the web, you can find it in public libraries. Find old advertisements from the 19th century. There were always ads, lots of ads. By the late 19th century, particular commodities would usually have a line drawn, a small little image. And then you would get 3, 4, 5 paragraphs of densely packed text explaining what this thing did and why it was good for you. Contrast that with the 1920s. By the 1920s, the amount of text recedes. And increasingly what you have are images. Carry that forward into our own present. And if I mention the company Nike, what comes to mind? The University of Oregon. What comes to mind? They underwrite the sports programs. But it's the swoosh. If you see that swoosh, that's all you need. You know it's Nike. Something happens with advertising in the 1920s. It's really important. What happens is that Madison Avenue advertisers start reading this fellow I mentioned to you earlier. His name is Freud. And by the 1920s, it's psychological advertising that takes hold in this country. It's used to promote the sale of goods, not on the basis of need, but want. desire, imagination.